The crystal glasses chimed delicately as guests moved between velvet-lined corridors of the private gallery, their refined murmurs blending with the strains of a quiet cello. Gold-framed landscapes, portraits, and contemporary pieces lined the walls, each one lit with careful precision. But the real theater of the evening wasn't on canvas. It was unfolding in whispered exchanges, sudden glances, and half-finished sentences that lingered like perfume in the air. Karoline Leavitt stood confidently beneath a large abstract mural, her silhouette sharp in her tailored crimson dress. She gestured calmly with a glass of white wine in one hand, her tone unwavering as she addressed a small group of listeners gathered around her. And border integrity is not just policy, it's identity. A sovereign nation must define who enters and who doesn't. Without that, we crumble, she declared firmly, scanning the nodding faces before her. A few steps away, standing alone near a modern sculpture shaped like a fractured globe, was Barron Trump. At 23, he stood tall in a crisp black suit, white shirt, and an ice blue tie that reflected the cool tones of the marble beneath his polished shoes. His light brown hair was neat, faintly catching the golden light of the chandelier, and his blue eyes seemed fixed on the sculpture. But in truth, his mind was elsewhere. He had heard Karoline's words, each one carving a line into the space between them. Eleanor Vance, a family friend and well-known art patron, approached them with casual grace, holding 2 glasses of Merlot. "Karoline, darling." "Barron." "You two must speak," she said with a knowing smile. "Karoline Leavitt, Barron Trump." Karoline turned, her expression polite but measured. She extended her hand. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Trump," she said, her voice calm but carrying a distinct edge. Barron smiled faintly as they shook hands. "Likewise, Miss Leavitt. It would have been impolite not to listen. You were speaking quite passionately." Karoline raised her brow slightly. "It's a topic that deserves passion. Immigration affects the soul of a nation." Barron nodded thoughtfully. "That's true, but perhaps it also reflects the soul of humanity, and we can't forget that part either." Her eyes narrowed a fraction. "And what exactly do you mean by that, Mr. Trump?" Barron turned slightly, resting a hand in his pocket. "I mean that, for many, immigration isn't a strategy. It's survival. War, famine, hopelessness, they push people forward. Not greed, not recklessness, just the hope for something more than pain." Karoline let out a soft laugh, not unkind but tinged with disbelief. The classic sympathy pitch. "Of course there are hard stories, but hard stories don't erase the law." "No, they don't," Barron answered. "But empathy isn't lawlessness. It's understanding. If your child were starving, would you wait 10 years for paperwork?" There was a pause, just long enough to feel the shift in the air. "I'd follow the law," Karoline answered, her voice steady. "Even if the law failed you?" Barron asked, gently but insistently. "Even if it took so long, your child didn't make it?" Her lips parted, but no reply came immediately. From across the room, Eleanor gestured again. "Barron, dear Brittany Hathaway's asking for you." He inclined his head toward Karoline. "It was a conversation worth having. Maybe we'll finish it someday." "Maybe," Karoline replied, the word lingering in the space between them long after Barron stepped away. She turned back to her wine, but something had shifted. His words, unexpected, unpolished, had left a mark. The night outside had cooled, and moonlight spilled like pale silk across the stone terrace of the gallery. A soft jazz trio played beneath an awning, their melody weaving through the low hum of evening conversations. Barron had stepped away from the main hall, the voices and champagne chatter beginning to feel more like static than dialogue. He found himself staring out over the manicured gardens, hands clasped loosely behind his back. The stillness was welcome but short-lived. Footsteps approached, slow and measured. Karoline's voice broke the quiet like a match in the dark. "I wasn't expecting someone named Trump to quote starvation and mercy before law," she said. "I suppose I thought I knew what you stood for." Barron didn't turn at first. "You thought I would echo your certainty." "That I would wear the name like armor," he replied, his voice calm. "But certainty is a comfort I've never trusted." She stepped closer, now just behind him. "So what is it you believe in then? Boundaries with no borders? Chaos in the name of compassion?" "No," he said, finally turning to face her. I believe the law should serve people, not imprison them. I believe in accountability, yes, but not indifference. Karoline crossed her arms. And what do you do when compassion costs lives? When a porous border brings drugs, trafficking, danger into the country you claim to love? Barron looked at her, his gaze unwavering. You close the holes, Karoline, but not by shutting the door entirely. There's a difference between building walls and building gates. One assumes everyone is a threat. The other assumes some might need help. It's not softness, it's discernment. She hesitated, searching his face as if trying to understand whether he truly meant it or if this was some carefully crafted performance. But there was no script in his eyes, only the weight of something lived, something earned. Do you know what happens when you let too many in? She asked, her tone lower now. You lose your country. You lose your values. Barron's voice softened, but not with weakness, rather, with something deeper. And do you know what happens when you let no one in? You lose your soul. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Karoline looked away, her jaw tight. Do you think I'm heartless? She asked, not looking at him. No, Barron replied. I think you're afraid of losing what you love. And I understand that. But fear makes poor policy. It breeds cruelty dressed as caution. A long silence stretched between them. Somewhere, laughter erupted from inside the gallery. It felt alien out here, like it belonged to another universe. Karoline turned toward the garden steps. You know, I didn't come out here to be changed. I didn't come here to change you, Barron said. I just hoped you might feel something shift. She paused on the first step. And if I did? Then we're both no longer who we were yesterday, Barron answered. Karoline glanced back at him, her expression unreadable. Then she walked slowly down the stairs, her figure disappearing into the shadows of the garden. And for the first time that night, Barron Trump didn't feel like he had won or lost a debate. He felt like he had opened a window in a house long sealed shut. The following weeks passed like a sequence of fogged-up mirrors, reflections forming only for brief moments before dissipating again. Barron had never been one for small talk, yet Karoline Leavitt lingered in his mind far longer than any political opponent or celebrity he had ever encountered. Her words, sharp as they had been, had stayed with him, gnawing at the edges of his certainty. It was a Tuesday morning when their paths crossed again. This time it was at a gala held at a prestigious Washington event hall, one of those places where the chandeliers glittered with wealth and the conversations carried the weight of power. Barron had almost convinced himself that he could ignore the tension between them, that he could bury his curiosity under the noise of politics and ambition. But as soon as he stepped into the hall, he saw her. Karoline stood near the grand staircase, her presence as commanding as the pillars of marble surrounding her. She was speaking to a group of lobbyists, laughing in a way that almost sounded rehearsed, though there was something tired in the cadence of her words. Barron felt an odd compulsion to approach. He wasn't sure whether it was the lingering conversation they had shared or something else, a sense that a door had opened between them, even if it was just a crack. He made his way through the sea of faces, his gaze fixed on her. As he got closer, the lobbyists parted, and Karoline turned to face him, her eyes narrowing slightly in recognition. Barron, she said, her voice carefully neutral, but there was a flicker of something beneath it. I didn't expect to see you here. I could say the same, Barron replied, his tone light but his eyes searching hers. But I suppose there are no coincidences, are there? Karoline tilted her head slightly, considering him. No, she agreed after a beat. I suppose not. There was a moment of silence. The air between them was thick, charged with something unspoken. I wanted to talk to you, Barron said, finally breaking the tension, about what we discussed last time. The whole wall versus gate thing. I've been thinking about it, Karoline's brow furrowed as she studied him. I assumed that debate had ended with you on one side and me on the other. He shook his head slowly. It's never that simple, Karoline. Not with people, not with lives. I can't ignore the complexity of the issue, no matter how clean the solution looks from a distance. And what do you want me to say, Barron? She asked, her voice a touch sharper now. That I should change everything I believe just because of one conversation? No, he said, his voice steady. I don't think I can change your mind. But maybe you'll look at things a little differently. Maybe there's room for us to find some common ground. I know it's hard to believe, but we both want the same thing. A strong country, a safe country, but with the humanity that makes it worth defending. Caroline's lips parted, as if to retort, but she stopped herself. The words seemed stuck, lodged somewhere between her pride and her conscience. Barron continued, "You said that a porous border would destroy our values. And I get that. I do. But what if, instead of seeing them as a threat, we saw them as part of the same human story? What if we tried to integrate the help without jeopardizing the safety?" Her expression softened, just a fraction. It was the briefest of shifts, but it was there. "I'm not saying it's easy," he added, his voice low. "I'm not even saying I have the answers. But I think it's a conversation worth having. A real one." Karoline looked away, as though considering his words carefully. The chatter in the room had grown louder, but she was distant, somewhere far beyond the glittering lights and the bustle of politicians and power players. When she met his gaze again, there was something different in her eyes, not agreement, not full acceptance, but a silent acknowledgement of the complexity of the world they shared. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice quieter now, more vulnerable than Barron had ever heard it. "Maybe we're not as far apart as I thought." And with that, she turned back to her group, a polite smile returning to her face as if she had to don her armor once more. Barron lingered for a moment longer, watching her retreat into the crowd. His mind was still swirling with questions, questions that might never have answers. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like the conversation wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Let's keep the conversation going. Subscribe, share, and drop your thoughts below. Your perspective is valuable and might inspire others.